The wind has teeth today. It bites at Silas Thorne's exposed skin, a rabid thing chewing through the worn fabric of his collar. He hunches lower over the saddle horn, letting his horse, Boulder, pick its own way through the scree and stubborn sagebrush. The sky is the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mass of purple and gray that promises a storm of biblical proportions. He'd stayed in dusty Harmony Creek longer than intended, arguing with the clerk at the land office over a tax assessment that felt more like theft. Now, the argument felt foolish, a waste of precious daylight. His ranch, a hard-won piece of solitude nestled in the foothills, is still 2 hours away, and the temperature is dropping with an unnatural speed. It's a flicker of movement that catches his eye, something out of place against the dun-colored landscape. Not the russet flash of a fox or the bound of a deer. It's a patch of pale color huddled at the base of a granite outcrop, a place that offers little shelter from the coming onslaught. He pulls Boulder to a halt, the horse snorting its displeasure into the cold air. Silas squints, his eyes accustomed to picking out stray cattle from a distance. This is no cow. It's a person, a woman, by the looks of the tattered dress. What in God's name is anyone doing out here, miles from any road, with the sky about to open up and drown the world? He nudges Boulder forward, his hand resting instinctively on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle in its scabbard. Caution is a man's best friend in these parts. As he gets closer, the scene resolves into a portrait of pure misery. She is curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair, a tangled mat of dark brown, whips across a face that is a roadmap of cruelty. One eye is swollen shut, a violent purple against the pallor of her skin. A cut splits her lower lip. Her dress is torn at the shoulder and hemmed with grime. And her feet, tucked beneath the ragged edge of her skirt, are bare, raw, bruised, and bloody against the sharp stones. She isn't moving. For a terrible second, he thinks he's found a corpse. Then, her head lifts. The one good eye, a startling shade of green, fixes on him. It's not a look of hope or pleading. It's the terrified, vacant stare of a cornered animal, expecting another blow. He swings down from the saddle, his movements slow and deliberate, the way he would approach a spooked colt. He unhooks his canteen. "Ma'am," he says, his voice a low rumble, and used to conversation. "You need water." He holds it out. She flinches back, pressing herself harder against the cold rock. He sets the canteen on the ground and slides it toward her with the toe of his boot. He backs away a few steps, giving her space. For a long minute, she just watches him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, hitching breaths. Then, with a pained effort that seems to cost her everything, she reaches for the canteen. Her hands tremble as she fumbles with the cap. She drinks greedily, water spilling down her chin and onto the bodice of her ruined dress. When she's done, she lets the canteen fall to the ground. He moves to retrieve it, and her gaze drops to the dirt. She seems to shrink into herself, trying to become smaller, to vanish. Her voice, when it comes, is a bare whisper, cracked and hoarse, carried away almost instantly by the wind. "Don't gaze," she murmurs. The words are not a command, but a plea born of a shame so profound it suffocates. She is begging him not to see her degradation, not to witness her brokenness. In that moment, Silas sees more than the bruises and the dirt. He sees the iron will it must have taken to get this far, the spirit that refused to be extinguished. He sees the town of Harmony Creek in his mind's eye, the suspicious glances, the cruel gossip, the way they would treat her, like a piece of damaged goods to be used up or discarded. He sees the cold cell in the sheriff's office, the questions she can't answer, the fate that awaits a lone, battered woman with no one to claim her. He looks at the bruised sky, then back at the woman who is begging for the mercy of invisibility. A hard, clear certainty settles in his chest. It is not a choice born of logic, but of instinct. A sudden, unshakable conviction about the only thing to be done. He walks toward her, and this time she doesn't flinch, only closes her eye as if to brace herself. He stops before her, the wind whipping his long duster around his legs. And then, Silas Thorne, a man who thought his life was set in stone, does the one thing he never imagined. He kneels, bringing his face level with hers, forcing her to see him. "Marry me." he says, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. There's more to this woman than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The proposal hangs in the air between them, as stark and unbelievable as the landscape itself. Her one good eye flies open, wide with shock and disbelief. She stares at him, searching his face for the trick, the cruelty behind the words. But she finds none. His expression is grim, weathered by sun and solitude, but his eyes hold a steady, serious light. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a proposition. It was something else entirely. An anchor thrown to a drowning woman. And with 3 words, marry me, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. Earlier that day, the town of Harmony Creek had felt like a cage. Silas had tied Boulder to the hitching rail outside the mercantile, the same rail his father had used 30 years prior. The town hadn't changed much. The buildings still sagged with a kind of weary resignation, their false fronts peeling under the relentless sun. The faces were different, some of them, but the expressions were the same. A pinched, hard-bitten suspicion of anyone who didn't fit neatly into their small, ordered world. Silas, with his isolated ranch and his quiet, solitary ways, had never quite fit. He was respected for his honesty and his tireless work ethic, but he was an outsider in his own land, a man who preferred the company of his horse and the vast, silent mountains to the petty dramas of town. He had gone to the land office first. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose body seemed to be slowly dissolving into his starched collar, had slid the new tax assessment across the desk with a pursed-lipped satisfaction. The number was twice what it had been the year before. A clerical error, Silas had stated, his voice flat. The county sees it differently, Mr. Thorne, Abernathy had chirped, refusing to meet his eyes. Improvements to the territory require funding. Roads, schools. There isn't a road within 10 miles of my land, and I have no children to send to your school, Silas had countered. He knew what this was. A few of the bigger cattle barons, men like Jedediah Croft, had been eyeing his valley for years. It had a reliable creek, a rare blessing in this dry country. Squeezing a man out with taxes was an old, dirty trick. He argued for an hour, a long, draining affair that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He left with the same piece of paper and a lighter wallet, the injustice of it a hot coal in his gut. His mood was no better when he entered the mercantile. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and Mrs. Gable's cloying perfume. She presided over the counter like a hawk on a branch, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Silas, she'd said, her voice dripping with the false sweetness she reserved for customers she felt superior to. Been a while. Life must be lonely out on that rock pile of yours since Martha passed. The mention of his late wife was a casual, cruel twist of the knife. Martha had been gone 5 years, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley, but the ache of her absence was a constant companion. Just the supplies, Clara, he had said, his voice clipped. He'd given her his list: flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. As she gathered the items, a group of women entered, their voices a flurry of excited gossip. They were clustered around a new mail-order bride, a pale, nervous girl who looked no older than 16. They were dissecting her appearance, her dress, her prospects with the cheerful savagery of hens pecking a weaker bird to death. Silas felt a surge of disgust. He paid for his goods, packed them into his saddlebags, and left without another word, the sound of their brittle laughter following him out the door. The world, it seemed to him then, was a place full of predators and prey, and he was tired of watching the predators win. He had ridden out of Harmony Creek feeling the weight of his 40 years. He was a man alone, fighting to hold on to a piece of land that the world seemed determined to take from him. His life was a repeating cycle of hard labor, from sunup to sundown, with no one to share the small victories or the heavy burdens. He had accepted his lot. He had made his peace with solitude, or so he had thought. But as he rode towards the storm-darkened horizon, the silence of the landscape had felt less like peace and more like a profound and unending emptiness. It was into that emptiness that the universe had thrown this broken girl. Alara. He didn't know her name then. He knew nothing about her except the raw evidence of her suffering. As he knelt before her on the cold, hard ground, the wind tearing at them, He wasn't thinking about loneliness or taxes or the gossips in town. He was thinking of the look in her eye, the look of an animal that had been beaten so often it no longer knew what a kind hand was. He had seen that look in horses, but never in a human being. And he had found, to his own surprise, that it was something he could not abide. His proposal wasn't about love or companionship. It was about protection. It was a shield, a name, a roof, a claim. In the eyes of the law and the cruel, prying world, a husband had rights. A lone woman had none. He was offering her the only armor he possessed, his name. Her shock slowly melted into a desperate, frantic calculation. Her green eye darted from his face to the menacing sky, then to the unforgiving wilderness stretching in every direction. She had no shoes, no food, no shelter. She had run from one hell only to find herself on the doorstep of another, slower one, death by exposure. This man, this stranger, was offering a third option. An impossible, insane option, but one that led away from the freezing rocks. She saw the quiet resolve in his face. He wasn't a man who wasted words. He meant it. Why? She couldn't fathom. Perhaps he was mad. Perhaps he was a different kind of monster. But the hand he hadn't offered, the way he had given her space, the steady quietness of his presence, it was different from the loud, possessive cruelty she had known. It was a risk. Her entire life had become a series of risks, each one more desperate than the last. This was just one more. She gave a small, jerky nod, a motion so slight it was almost lost in the shiver that racked her body. It was enough. Silas rose to his feet. "We need to go? Now." He turned and walked to Boulder, pulling a spare blanket from his bedroll. He came back and draped it over her shoulders without a word. The wool was coarse and smelled of horse and wood smoke. It was the warmest thing she had felt in days. He then moved with an efficiency that spoke of a life of physical labor. He easily lifted her, her body shockingly light, and set her on the front of his saddle. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain as her battered body protested the movement. "Sorry," he grunted. He mounted behind her, his large frame a solid wall against the wind. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady, his touch impersonal and firm. He gathered the reins, and with a click of his tongue, urged Boulder into a steady walk, turning toward the distant, dark line of the foothills where his home lay hidden. The journey was a blur of misery and a strange, nascent sense of security. The wind rose to a gale, driving icy needles of rain that felt like glass against Alara's skin. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through her body. She gritted her teeth, her head lolling against Silas's chest, too weak to hold it up. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of the man behind her. He was a shield against the storm, his body taking the brunt of the wind. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through the thick layers of his coat, a rhythm that was calm and unhurried in the midst of the tempest. It was a sound of life, and she clung to it. For Silas, the ride was a battle against the elements and his own churning thoughts. What had he done? He had just bound himself to a complete stranger, a woman who looked like she'd been dragged through hell backwards. The people of Harmony Creek would have a field day with this. They'd call him a fool, or worse. They'd say he'd taken in a whore, a thief, a runaway. The scandal would stick to him like mud. And the woman herself, what fresh trouble would she bring to his door? Who was she running from? Whoever it was, they had left their mark on her with a heavy hand. He was inviting that violence into his quiet life. He looked down at the top of her head, her wet hair plastered to her scalp. She was so small, so fragile in his arms. He felt the tremors that shook her body, a combination of cold and pain. And his doubt evaporated, replaced by a grim, protective certainty. He had given his word. He had knelt on the ground and made a promise. A thorn did not go back on his word. Whatever came, he would face it. It was full dark when they finally reached the ranch. The cabin was a small, dark shape against the slightly less dark shape of the mountains. A single light would have made it a beacon, but there was no one to leave a lamp burning for him. Until now. He dismounted and carefully lifted her down. Her legs buckled, and he caught her, swinging her into his arms. He carried her across the muddy yard and onto the porch, kicking the door open. He set her down gently in the single armchair by the cold hearth, a chair that had been Martha's. The cabin was one large room, spare and meticulously clean. A bed stood in one corner, a table and two chairs in the center, and a cast-iron stove in the other. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins, books, and a few faded photographs. It was the home of a man who had everything he needed and nothing more. Silas moved quickly, lighting the lamp on the table. The warm, yellow glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the full extent of her injuries. In the harsh, direct light, she looked even worse. He swore under his breath. "Stay," he commanded softly, and went to the stove. He had it roaring in minutes, the promise of heat beginning to fill the chilly room. He put a kettle on to boil, and then went to a small chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a tin box containing his meager medical supplies, carbolic soap, bandages, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. He came back and knelt before her again. "This will sting." She watched him with that same wide, wary eye. She didn't speak, didn't protest. She simply endured as he gently washed the grime from the cuts on her face and hands with a clean rag. He was surprisingly gentle, his large, calloused fingers moving with a careful precision. When he cleaned the gash on her lip, a tear escaped her good eye and tracked a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. He pretended not to notice. He bandaged her feet, which were a bloody mess of cuts and deep bruises. When he was done, he stood up. "You need to get out of those wet things." He went to a large wooden wardrobe and opened it. Most of it was empty. On one side hung his few spare shirts and trousers. On the other, a small collection of dresses. Martha's. He hadn't touched them since he'd packed them away 5 years ago. He hesitated for only a second before pulling out a simple, high-collared nightgown of white flannel. It was plain, practical, and clean. He laid it on the bed. "I'll be outside. To see to the horse." He left without looking at her, closing the door firmly behind him. Outside, the storm had fully broken. Rain lashed down in solid sheets. He led Boulder to the small, sturdy barn, unsaddled him, and gave him a vigorous rub-down and a double ration of oats. He worked with methodical slowness, his mind a whirlwind. A wife. He had a wife. A battered, silent, terrified wife who was currently wearing his dead wife's nightgown. The sheer, stark madness of it all washed over him. He leaned his forehead against Boulder's warm flank, the familiar smell of horse and hay a comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. When he returned to the cabin some time later, soaked to the skin, he found her asleep in the armchair, the clean white nightgown ridiculously large on her thin frame. Her wet, ruined dress was in a heap on the floor. The fire was blazing, and the room was warm. For a moment, he just stood there, dripping on the floorboards, and watched her. In sleep, the tension left her face. She looked younger, more vulnerable. A deep, unfamiliar ache settled in his chest. It was a complicated feeling, a mix of pity, responsibility, and something else he couldn't name. He quietly gathered her dirty dress and pushed it into the stove, where it was consumed by the flames in a hiss of steam. He was erasing her past, one piece at a time. Then, he took the blankets from his bed, laid them out on the floorboards in front of the fire, and settled down for the night, leaving her the warmth and comfort of the bed. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the roar of the storm outside and the soft, even sound of her breathing inside, and wondered what the first day of his new life would bring. The first days were defined by silence. A thick, heavy silence that filled all the spaces between the necessary sounds of life. The crackle of the fire, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the creak of the floorboards. Alara, as he eventually learned her name was, moved through his cabin like a phantom. She stayed in the bed for the first 2 days, sleeping for long stretches, the deep, exhaustive sleep of a body pushed beyond its limits. Silas cooked plain, hearty meals, oatmeal, broth, stew, and left them on a stool beside the bed. He never saw her eat, but the bowl was always empty when he returned. He went about his chores, the rhythm of his life unchanged. He mucked out the barn, chopped wood, checked his fences. But everything felt different. The cabin was no longer just his. There was another presence within its walls, a quiet, wounded thing he had brought in from the storm. He found himself walking more softly, closing the door with less of a bang. He was acutely aware of her, of every small sound she made. On the third day, he came in from the cold to find her out of bed. She was standing by the stove, her back to him, stirring the stew he had left to simmer. She was still wearing Martha's nightgown, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She didn't turn when he entered, but he saw her shoulders tense. "Smells good," he said, breaking the quiet. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They ate their supper in their usual silence at the small table. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. Her movements were small and precise. She ate slowly, as if relearning the simple act of nourishment. The bruises on her face were beginning to fade, turning from a violent purple to a sickly yellow-green. Her eye was still swollen, but she could open it a crack. She still refused to meet his gaze, keeping her eyes fixed on her bowl. After the meal, she gathered the plates. Before he could stop her, she had taken them to the wash basin and begun to clean them. It was the first task she had undertaken, the first small step toward claiming a place in this new life. Silas didn't say anything. He simply sat and watched her, the flickering lamplight catching the determined set of her jaw. From then on, she began to contribute in small ways. She swept the floor. She mended a tear in one of his work shirts with neat, tiny stitches that were far more skilled than his own clumsy efforts. She seemed to be searching for ways to repay her debt, to earn her keep. Silas understood. She was trying to turn their strange bargain into a transaction, something she could comprehend. He let her. It was too soon for anything else. One afternoon, he was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, when she approached. She stood before him for a full minute, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My name," she whispered, her voice still rough from disuse, "is Alara." He stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. He made sure his gaze was steady, not pitying. "Silas," he replied. It was a formal introduction, absurd in its context. They were husband and wife, yet they were only now learning each other's names. She nodded again, that small, bird-like motion, and retreated to her side of the room. But something had shifted. A name was an identity. She was no longer just the battered woman from the storm. She was Alara. The next week, a cold snap hit, and a section of the northern fence line collapsed under the weight of a heavy, wet snow. It was a critical problem. If his small herd of cattle wandered, he could lose them in the canyons. He spent the morning gathering tools and loading fence posts onto his work sled. As he was about to leave, the cabin door opened. Alara stood there, wearing one of his old, oversized wool coats over her nightgown. On her feet were a pair of his thick wool socks. "I can help," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's cold work," he warned her. "I am not made of glass." There was a flicker of steel in her voice that surprised him. He looked at her for a moment, at the determined set of her chin, and then nodded. "All right, but we'll need to find you some proper boots." The work was brutal. The wind was relentless, and the ground was frozen solid, making it nearly impossible to dig new post holes. Silas worked with a grim efficiency, his powerful shoulders straining as he swung the heavy maul. To his surprise, Alara was a tireless worker. She couldn't match his strength, but she was quick and clever. She hauled the old, broken posts away, stretched the new wire, and handed him staples with a timing that soon became uncanny. She worked without complaint, her face red with cold, her hands clumsy in a pair of his leather gloves. They stopped midday to eat. He had brought jerky and hard biscuits. They sat on a fallen log, their backs to the wind, sharing the simple meal in silence. But this silence was different. It was the comfortable silence of two people engaged in a shared struggle. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the lingering bruises. He saw the strength in the line of her back, the resilience in the way she chewed the tough jerky. He realized he hadn't thought of her as a burden all morning. He had thought of her as a partner. As they were packing up to head back, her foot slipped on a patch of ice. She fell hard, her arm twisting beneath her. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. He was at her side in an instant. "My wrist," she gasped, cradling it to her chest. He examined it gently. It wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained. He tore a strip from a spare rag and fashioned a makeshift sling to immobilize it. She watched him, her breathing ragged with pain, but her eyes held a new expression. It was a look of cautious, questioning trust. He had touched her again, and it had been a touch of care, not violence. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was different again. The shared labor and her minor injury had broken down another layer of the wall between them. He insisted she sit by the fire while he made supper, and he helped her cut her meat, a simple act of service that felt strangely intimate. After they ate, he did something he hadn't done since Martha was alive. He took a book down from the shelf. It was an old, battered copy of Shakespeare's plays. He opened it to a random page. "Do you read?" he asked. She shook her head. The master's wife. She said it was a sin for a girl to fill her head with useless notions. A cold anger coiled in Silas's stomach. He cleared his throat. "Well, where I come from, it's a sin to leave a good story unread." And he began to read. His voice was low and steady, and used to reading aloud, but he spoke the words with a simple, unadorned reverence. He read from The Tempest, a story of storms and shipwrecks and finding a new world. Alara sat perfectly still, her injured wrist resting in her lap, her good eye fixed on the fire. She was listening with an intensity that made him feel as though he were offering her water after a long thirst. He read until his voice grew hoarse and the fire burned down to embers. When he finally stopped, she looked over at him. For the first time, she met his gaze directly and held it. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't define. He felt as if he had just given her a gift, a small piece of a world she had been denied. As he banked the fire and rolled out his bedroll on the floor, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life was no longer his own. And for the first time in 5 years, the thought did not bring him sorrow. It brought a quiet, terrifying flicker of hope. The sprained wrist forced a new level of interdependence. Alara couldn't cook or clean effectively with one hand, and Silas, unaccustomed to domestic tasks, found himself in a clumsy dance of shared responsibility. He would chop vegetables while she directed him from her chair, her instructions quiet but precise. He learned that she knew things: how to make a thin stew hearty with the right herbs, how to tell if bread was rising properly just by its smell. These were fragments of a life lived before, a life he knew nothing about. She offered these small pieces of herself without context, like clues to a mystery he was slowly beginning to unravel. They needed supplies, and more importantly, Alara needed proper clothes and boots. The trip to Harmony Creek was unavoidable. Silas dreaded it. He knew what they would see: a reclusive rancher with a strange, bruised woman. The town's collective imagination would run wild. He broached the subject one morning over breakfast. "We need to go to town," he said, not looking at her. "You need clothes. Boots." She stiffened, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. He saw the fear flash in her eyes. The world outside the safe confines of the ranch was a threat. "They will stare," she said, her voice barely audible. "Let them," he replied, his tone harder than he intended. "You are my wife. Your place is with me. No one has the right to question it." He said the words to reassure her, but they sounded strange and proprietary in his own ears. My wife. The lie had been spoken so often between them, and to himself, that it was starting to feel like a kind of truth. He saw her swallow hard and nod, accepting his decision as she accepted everything, with a quiet, steely resignation. 2 days later, they rode into Harmony Creek. Alara wore another of Martha's dresses, a plain gray wool that he'd managed to take in with his own clumsy stitches. It hung on her frame, but it was better than the nightgown. He'd also found an old bonnet of Martha's, which Alara used to shadow her face. Silas rode with his back straight, his expression set like granite, daring anyone to comment. The town did not disappoint. As they rode down the main street, conversations ceased. Windows were peeked through. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. It was as if they were a traveling spectacle. Silas felt Alara shrink behind him on the horse, her hands clutching his coat. He felt a hot surge of anger. He wanted to shout at them all, to tell them to mind their own damn business, but he knew it would only make things worse. He tied Boulder in front of the mercantile and helped Alara down. He kept a firm hand on her elbow as they walked up the steps, a gesture that was both supportive and possessive. Inside, the store fell silent. Mrs. Gable was at the counter, her face a mask of sour curiosity. "Silas," she said, her eyes flicking from him to Alara and back again, taking in the bonnet and the ill-fitting dress. "I see you've found some company." "My wife, Clara," Silas said, his voice low and cold. "Mrs. Thorne. She needs a full kit. Boots, dresses, underthings. Something warm for winter." The title Mrs. thorn hung in the air, a direct challenge. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows shot up. She looked Alara up and down, her gaze lingering on the faded bruises still visible on her cheek. A cruel, knowing smirk played on her lips. "Well, isn't that a surprise?" she said, her voice oozing insinuation. "You work fast, Silas." Or perhaps she does. Before Silas could respond, Alara spoke. "The boots first, if you please," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the thick atmosphere of judgment. She did not look at Mrs. Gable, instead focusing on a row of sturdy-looking work boots on a shelf. Her refusal to engage with the woman's venom was more effective than any angry retort from Silas could have been. It dismissed her. Slightly taken aback, Mrs. Gable huffed and moved to get the boots. Silas watched Alara, a new respect dawning. She was not just a victim. Beneath the fear and the pain, there was a core of dignity, an unbending spine that even the town's most vicious gossip could not touch. They bought what they needed in a tense, clipped transaction. Silas paid in cash, counting out the bills deliberately on the counter. He bought more than they needed, a bag of sweets for no reason, a bolt of pretty blue calico cloth, a new ribbon. Small luxuries that were a silent rebuke to Mrs. Gable's insinuations. They were not destitute charity cases. They were a family, providing for their own. As they left the store, Sheriff Cobb was standing on the boardwalk across the street, watching them. He was a big, beefy man who valued a quiet town above all else. He tipped his hat to Silas, but his eyes were hard and questioning as they rested on Alara. It was a look Silas knew well. It was the look of a man cataloging a potential problem. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The packages were tied to the back of the saddle. Alara sat behind Silas, her new, sturdy boots a solid weight against his own. The tension of the town slowly seeped away as the familiar peaks of their mountains came into view. As they rounded the last bend, with the cabin visible in the valley below, Alara spoke. "The clouds," she said softly, her voice close to his ear. "They look like sleeping giants." Silas looked up. The afternoon clouds were indeed piled high against the peaks, their soft, gray underbellies glowing in the late sun. He had looked at those same clouds 1,000 times and seen nothing but the promise of rain or snow. He had never seen them as sleeping giants. "I suppose they do," he said. It was a small thing, an observation about the sky, but it was the first time she had offered a piece of her own mind, her own imagination, without being prompted. It was a crack in the wall of her silence, a glimpse of the person who existed beyond the trauma. He felt something shift inside him, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. That night, a nightmare tore Alara from her sleep. A choked, terrified scream ripped through the quiet of the cabin. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding. He crossed the room to the bed where she was thrashing, tangled in her blankets, her hands batting at an unseen enemy. "No, please. Jedediah, no," she cried out, her voice raw with terror. Jedediah. The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Silas reached out and gently took her by the shoulders. "Alara, wake up. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing. For a moment, she looked at him with the same primal fear she'd had when he first found her. Then, recognition dawned. The terror receded, replaced by a wave of crushing shame. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Silas didn't know what to do. The rigid rules of their arrangement hadn't prepared him for this. He couldn't offer comfort like a real husband would, but he couldn't just walk away and leave her to her demons. He sat on the edge of the bed, a careful distance between them, and waited. After a long time, her sobs subsided. She took a shuddering breath. "He owned my indenture," she said to the darkness, her voice flat and hollow. "My father signed it before he died. I was to work for him for 5 years. To pay off a debt." She paused, gathering her strength. "He was a cruel man. He liked to show his power. The other workers, the livestock, me." The word hung there, heavy with unspoken meaning. "He thought owning my labor meant he owned me. All of me. I tried to refuse him. That's why." She gestured vaguely to her face. "He locked me in the root cellar. Said he'd keep me there until I learned to be grateful. I found a loose board. I ran. I just ran." Silas sat in the dark, listening to her fragmented story. An ugly, murderous rage built in him, cold and pure. "Jedediah, He knew the name. Jedediah Croft, one of the cattle barons from the next county. A man known for his wealth, his temper, and his ruthless ambition. The man who had been trying to squeeze Silas off his land. It all clicked into place. "He won't find you here," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "I won't let him." She looked up at him then, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" It was the question that had been hanging between them since the beginning. He thought for a long moment, searching for the honest answer. It was more than just pity now. It was more than a sense of duty. He looked at her, at the quiet strength she had shown, the dignity she clung to, the small flicker of life he had seen return to her eyes. "I want peace, Alara," he said, the words coming slowly. "Same as you. And I'm beginning to think I won't find it alone." It was the closest he had ever come to telling her the truth of his own desolate heart. It was an admission of his own need, a confession of his own loneliness. She stared at him, her eyes searching his. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression softened. The fear was replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. In their shared desire for peace, in their mutual brokenness, they had finally found a piece of common ground. He stood up and went back to his bedroll on the floor, leaving her in the quiet of the night. But the space between them no longer felt like a chasm. It felt like a beginning. The seasons began to turn, and with them, the rhythm of their life settled into a quiet harmony. The shared confession in the dark had changed things. The silence between them was no longer fraught with tension and uncertainty. It was now a comfortable, companionable quiet. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken choreography. He would be splitting logs, and she would appear with a tin cup of hot coffee at the exact moment his back began to ache. She would be weeding the small vegetable garden she had painstakingly coaxed from the rocky soil, and he would leave a bucket of fresh water for her without a word. He continued to read to her in the evenings. They finished The Tempest and moved on to a book of poetry. Alara, he discovered, loved the lyrical cadence of the words. One evening, as he read a line about the sea, she murmured, "I have never seen it." He paused, looking at her. Her eyes were distant, imagining an ocean she only knew from his words. He felt a sudden, fierce desire to show it to her, to give her all the things the world, and men like Jedediah Croft, had stolen from her. The feeling was so powerful it startled him. It felt dangerously close to love. He began teaching her things. He showed her how to use the small .22 rifle he kept for varmints. At first, she was terrified of the weapon, its loud crack echoing the violence she had known. But Silas was a patient teacher. He showed her how to hold it, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger gently. He set up tin cans on a fence post. Her first few shots went wide. "You're closing your eyes," he said, standing behind her. "Keep them open. See your target." He reached around her, his arms enclosing her, to adjust her grip. His chest was pressed against her back, his hand covering hers on the stock of the rifle. She froze, her entire body going rigid at the sudden intimacy. He felt it, and immediately started to pull away. "I'm sorry," he began. "No," she said quickly, her voice tight. It's all right." He stayed where he was, his warmth a solid presence around her. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap she used, the scent of her hair. He felt the slight tremble in her hands. "Breathe in," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "And out. Now squeeze." She did. The rifle cracked, and one of the tin cans flew off the post. A small, startled gasp of triumph escaped her lips. She turned her head to look at him, a genuine, unguarded smile lighting up her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. Her face, free from fear and sorrow, was beautiful. He found himself smiling back, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of his facial muscles. In that moment, standing in the clear mountain air with his arms around her, the pretense of their arrangement fell away, leaving a raw, unspoken truth in its wake. But the outside world did not forget them. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Silas was repairing a harness on the porch, he saw a rider approaching. It wasn't a neighbor. The man rode with the straight-backed posture of the law. It was Sheriff Cobb. Silas stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers, a feeling of cold dread settling in his stomach. Alara, who had been hanging laundry on the line, saw the rider too. She stopped, her hands frozen on a wet sheet, all the color draining from her face. "Go inside," Silas said, his voice low and firm. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "Go on, Alara. It's all right." She gave a small nod and hurried into the cabin, closing the door behind her. Silas walked to the edge of the porch to meet the sheriff. Cobb pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted. He didn't smile. "Thorn," he said, his eyes scanning the ranch, lingering on the closed cabin door. "Sheriff," Silas replied, his tone even. "What brings you out this way?" "Just making my rounds," Cobb said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Heard some talk in town. About you and your new wife." He said the word wife as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. "There's always talk in town," Silas said, leaning against a porch post, affecting a casualness he did not feel. "Mostly hot air." "This is more than hot air," Cobb countered, his voice hardening. "Jedediah Croft was in town last week. Asking questions. Put out a handsome reward for a runaway indentured servant. A girl. Matches the description of the woman you're keeping here." The threat was no longer a phantom from a nightmare. It had a name, a face, and a purpose. It was here. "I'm not keeping anyone, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice dropping, the cold anger he'd felt that night returning. "Alara is my wife. We were married by the circuit judge 2 months ago." This was a lie, but a necessary one. He had, in fact, ridden to the next county a month prior, found the traveling judge, and filed the paperwork. He'd forged her signature. He'd told himself it was for her protection, a piece of paper to ward off men like Cobb and Croft. But as he said the words now, he knew it was more than that. He had wanted to make it real. Cobb's eyes narrowed. He was a man who didn't like complications, and a legal marriage was a significant complication. An indentured servant was property. A wife was a wife. "You have the certificate?" he demanded. "Inside," Silas said. "But you're not welcome in my home unless you have a warrant." They stood in silence for a long moment. A battle of wills played out in the dusty ranch yard. Cobb was assessing the situation, weighing Croft's influence against the trouble of forcing his way into a man's home. Silas did not waver. He would die on this porch before he let this man, or any other, lay a hand on Alara. Finally, Cobb seemed to make a decision. "Croft is a powerful man, Thorn. He doesn't take kindly to people stealing his property." "She is not property," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. "She is Mrs. Thorn, and she is home. I suggest you tell Mr. Croft that the next time you see him." Cobb held his gaze for another second, then gave a curt nod. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. Silas watched him until he was a small dot in the distance. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He had won the skirmish, but he knew the war was coming. He turned and went back into the cabin. Alara was standing by the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the sill. She had heard everything. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jedediah knows I'm here." "Yes," Silas said. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he held back. "We knew this day might come." "What will we do?" she asked, her eyes pleading with him. He looked at her, at the terror that threatened to undo all the healing of the past few months. He saw the phantom of the broken, shoeless girl he had found by the rocks, and he knew he could not let her become that person again. The decision was simple. There was no choice to be made. "We will stand our ground," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "This is your home now, Alara, and I will not let any man take you from it." He had made a promise to her in the midst of a storm, a promise born of pity. Now, in the quiet of their home, with a different kind of storm gathering on the horizon, he made another. This one was born of something far deeper, something that felt terrifyingly and wonderfully like love. He would stand between her and the world, and he would not be moved. The coming of Jedediah Croft was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The knowledge settled over the small cabin like a shroud, thick and suffocating. In the days that followed, a new tension entered their quiet life. Every shadow on the horizon, every rider in the distance, sent a jolt of fear through Alara. She grew quiet again, the easy companionship they had built slowly eroding under the weight of her anxiety. She stopped working in her garden, and the sound of her humming, which had become a familiar backdrop to Silas's days, was gone. Silas watched her withdraw, and it felt like a physical pain. He had coaxed this fragile, wounded bird out of its shell, only to have the shadow of the hawk drive it back into hiding. His anger at Croft burned with a white-hot intensity. It was no longer about a piece of land or a matter of principle. It was personal. Croft was trying to destroy the one good thing that had entered Silas's life in years. He began to prepare. He spent an afternoon cleaning and oiling every firearm he owned. The Winchester, a double-barreled shotgun, and an old Colt revolver. He did the work methodically at the kitchen table, the metallic clicks and scrapes echoing in the silent cabin. Alara watched him, her face pale. The weapons were a stark, tangible symbol of the violence that was coming for them. "You think he will come himself?" she asked, her voice a thin thread of sound. "A man like Croft doesn't like loose ends," Silas replied, not looking up from the revolver cylinder. "And he doesn't like being told no. He'll come." He tried to reassure her, to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He was one man against a wealthy baron who could likely hire a dozen guns if he chose. But the ranch was defensible. The cabin was sturdy, built of thick logs, with a clear line of sight across the main approach. It was his land. He knew every rock, every ravine. He would have the advantage of terrain, if not numbers. One evening, he found her staring at the marriage certificate he had tacked to the wall beside the hearth. It was a simple document, his name and hers written in the judge's spidery script. A legal fiction that had become their only shield. "You lied," she said softly, not looking at him. "You signed my name." Silas stopped, his heart sinking. He had known this moment would come. "I did," he admitted. "I thought it would give you more protection. Make it official. I should have asked you. Would you have taken me back to him if I had said no?" He turned to face her fully. "Never," he said, his voice fierce. "That paper doesn't matter, Alara. My word matters. I told you I would keep you safe. I meant it." She finally looked at him, her green eyes searching his face. "You could be killed," she whispered. "For me. A woman you found on the side of a hill. You're more than that now," he said simply. The truth of the statement hung between them, vast and undeniable. She was no longer a stranger. She was the woman who smiled when he read poetry, who knew how to make his coffee just right, whose presence had transformed his empty house into a home. A profound sadness entered her eyes. "I never wanted to bring this trouble to you, Silas." "You didn't," he said, taking a step closer. "Croft did. This fight is with him, not you." He hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her arm. She didn't pull away. "We will face him together." Her hand came up and covered his, her fingers cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact, a silent acknowledgement of their alliance, their partnership. In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and a runaway. They were a husband and wife, preparing to defend their home. The waiting was the worst part. A week passed. The autumn leaves turned from gold to a brittle brown. A cold wind stripped them from the trees, leaving the branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Every morning, Silas would climb the small ridge behind the cabin and scan the horizon. Every evening, he would lock the door and bar it, a precaution he had never taken before. Then, one afternoon he saw them, 3 riders, coming up the valley road. They were still miles away, but there was no mistaking their intent. They rode steadily, not like men passing through. He came back to the cabin, his face grim. Alara was kneading dough on the table. She looked up and saw his expression, and her hands stilled. She knew. "They're here," he said. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Her first instinct was to run, to hide. But then she looked at Silas. He was calm. His face was set, his eyes clear. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. His courage was a tangible thing, a shield she could feel even from across the room. And it gave her a measure of her own. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. "You will stay in here, away from the window. The shotgun is by the hearth. You know how to use it. You only use it if they get past me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat tight. "This is my fight, Alara. I will not have you harmed." He went to the door and took his Winchester from the pegs beside it. He checked the load, his movements economical and sure. He turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, things about how she had changed his life, about the feelings that had grown in the quiet spaces between them. But there was no time, and he was not a man for such words. Instead, he walked over to her. He raised a hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray bit of flour. "Be brave," he whispered. Then he turned, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. He stood there, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. The three riders came into the yard and stopped. The man in the middle was large and florid, dressed in expensive clothes that were out of place on the frontier. His face was a mask of arrogance and impatience. Jedediah Croft. The two men with him were hard-faced and wore their guns tied low. "Hired muscle." Croft's eyes scanned the ranch with a dismissive sneer, then settled on Silas. "Thorne," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've come for my property." "You've come to the wrong place," Silas said, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "There's nothing here for you." Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you have her. The girl, Alara. My servant. She ran out on her contract. She belongs to me." "You're mistaken," Silas said, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "The only person here is my wife, Mrs. Thorne, and this is her home. You'll leave." The words, spoken in the open, in defiance of this powerful man, were a final, irrevocable declaration. Inside the cabin, Alara heard them. She crept to the window, peeking around the edge of the curtain. She saw Silas, standing alone on the porch, a solitary, unmovable figure against the backdrop of their home. She saw the sneering, cruel face of the man who had haunted her nightmares. Croft's face darkened with rage. "Your wife?" he spat. "You think a piece of paper from some drunkard judge changes anything? I paid for her. She's mine. I'll have her back, and I'll teach her a lesson about running that she'll never forget." He turned his venomous gaze toward the cabin. "Alara, get out here, you worthless girl. Don't make me come in there and drag you out." A tremor of pure terror went through Alara. His voice was the sound of pain, of humiliation, of the dark root cellar. Her body wanted to obey, to curl up and submit as she had been taught to do for years. But then she looked at Silas. He hadn't flinched. He stood his ground, a bastion of quiet strength. "Be brave," he had said. He was being brave for her. Could she do any less for him? For herself? The cabin door opened. Silas's head whipped around in surprise and alarm. Alara stepped out onto the porch and came to stand beside him. She was no longer the battered, shoeless girl. She was dressed in one of her new, simple dresses. Her hair was clean and tied back neatly. Her hands were trembling, but her head was high. Croft's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in a twisted kind of pleasure. "There she is," he purred. "Come on, girl. Time to go home." Alara looked not at Silas, but directly at Jedediah Croft. She looked at the man who had beaten her, starved her, and tried to break her spirit. And she felt the fear, but she also felt something else, a cold, clean anger that burned away the terror. She had a voice now. Silas had given it back to her. "I am not your property, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I am not your girl. I am his wife." She took a half-step closer to Silas, a small movement that was a declaration of allegiance. Croft's face contorted in fury. His pretense of civility vanished. "Why, you ungrateful little. After everything I did for you. I'll see you horsewhipped." He made a move to dismount, but stopped as Silas raised the Winchester, the muzzle now pointed squarely at Croft's chest. The click of the hammer being cocked was unervingly loud in the tense silence. "That's far enough," Silas said, his voice like chips of ice. "You heard the lady. This is her home. You are trespassing. I'm giving you 10 seconds to turn your horses around and ride out of this valley. If you're still here when I finish counting, I will assume you mean to do my wife harm, and I will defend my home." It was a clear, unambiguous threat. The two hired guns shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had been paid to intimidate a runaway servant, not to get into a shooting war with a determined homesteader on his own land. They looked at Silas, at his steady hands and his cold eyes, and they saw a man who would not hesitate to pull the trigger. 1. Silas began to count, his voice even and relentless. Croft stared at him, his face purple with impotent rage. He had miscalculated. He had expected a frightened girl and a cowed rancher. He had not expected this united front, this quiet, unshakable defiance. 2. Alara stood her ground, her hand finding the sleeve of Silas's coat and gripping it tightly. She was terrified, but she was no longer alone in her terror. She was part of this we he had spoken of. 3. The hired guns exchanged a look. This wasn't worth dying for. One of them subtly shook his head at Croft. "You'll regret this, Thorn." Croft snarled, finally realizing he had lost. "I'll ruin you. I'll see this ranch burned to the ground." 7. Silas said, ignoring the threats. 8. With a final, venomous curse, Croft wrenched his horse's head around. He spurred it viciously, galloping out of the yard, his 2 men following close behind. Their departure was ignominious, a rout. Silas and Alara stood on the porch, watching them go. They watched until the riders were nothing more than dust on the horizon. The rifle felt immensely heavy in Silas's hands. He slowly, carefully, uncocked it. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness and an equally profound quiet. The threat was gone. The storm had passed. He turned to Alara. She was still clutching his sleeve, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her eyes were shining with tears that were not of sorrow, but of relief and of fierce, triumphant pride. She had faced her demon and had not broken. He leaned the rifle against the cabin wall, and then he looked at her, truly looked at her, this woman who had stood beside him, who had found her voice and claimed her life. The wall between them, the last vestige of their strange arrangement, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the truth. "That marriage certificate," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The one I signed. It's a lot." She nodded, unable to speak. "I'd like to make it the truth," he went on, his gaze unwavering. "With the preacher. And your own name, signed in your own hand. If you'll have me, Alara. For real this time." It wasn't a proposal born of pity or necessity. It was a question asked from the heart, a plea for a shared future. She didn't need grand words or flowery promises. His actions on this porch had been the only vow she would ever need. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, the same smile he had seen when she'd hit the tin can. But this one was deeper, filled with a certainty and a joy that remade her features. She let go of his sleeve and reached out, her hand, no longer trembling, finding his. She laced her fingers through his, a simple, perfect connection. "Silas," she said, and the way she spoke his name was an answer, a promise, and a prayer all in one. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was crisp and clean. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees, a sound not of menace, but of peace. They stood together on the porch of their home, hands linked, looking out at the land that was theirs. It was a hard land, an unforgiving land, but it was their sanctuary. It was the place where a battered, shoeless woman and a lonely, quiet man had, against all odds, found not just shelter, but each other. The future was as vast and unknown as the darkening landscape, but they would face it together. His proposal had been a shield. Her acceptance was the beginning of a life. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.